Good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started. So today we'll learn about memory. Last class we learned about learning. Does anyone remember what learning is? You've already forgotten? Oh shit. Nobody remembers what learning is. Do you know what learning is?
I tried to do that.
All right. Well, learning, if you'll recall, apparently you don't, is the process that changes your knowledge or behavior because of your experience. Okay, because of your experience, you do something differently, you know something more. Memory refers to the persistence of learning over time. Okay, it's central to your identity, to your ability to function. Otherwise, like, you wouldn't know who you are and what to do. Right? The fact that learning actually changed your knowledge or behavior means that a memory, whether it's conscious or non-conscious, was formed. We can liken the concept of memory to a mysterious black box. We could take you and put you on a scale and weigh you and measure you. Much harder to do that with memory, because that's a concept, reasonably specific one that we can operationalize, but it's still a concept. And that concept, studying it is like studying a black box. Okay, you can see that something goes in it. I might tell you something, and I can see that something comes out of it. You recall what I told you, you remember it, you can repeat it, but I can't see what's going on inside the mysterious black box. Maybe I could theorize about how it works. Other people could do that too, and then you'd end up with competing theories. And then we could do some things to test the theory. Scientific models are theories about how some psychological process works. And there should be a mechanism that's postulated that explains how outcomes occur. And we use models to think and communicate about memory. So a model is a theory that explains something in psychology. And we study things that we can't see or touch physically. So we end up with these metaphors. You might have heard the term memory trace. The trace is where the memory is physically stored in your brain. No one's ever seen a memory trace. That's another concept. It's also an idea. No one's ever pulled a memory trace out of someone's brain and put it wiggling on a scale. It's a metaphor. It has some underlying reality. Yeah, somewhere in there, there's a physical representation of your memory. But we're not at a point yet in the development of psychology or neuroscience to know exactly what that looks like. So we use computers as a metaphor for memory. Okay. And so we could think about memories having an input. The input is kind of like the keyboard. Somehow things get in there. And then things are stored inside there. There's a processing unit. And then if you want to pull up a memory, that's displayed somehow. as a computer might display something on a monitor. There's some limitations to this metaphor. Computers engage in serial processing. They do one process after another, or one completes, another starts. They do that really, really quickly, way faster than we can. But humans have parallel processing. We have many different processes running at the same time. You have a conscious process that you're aware of, and then a whole bunch of non-conscious processes. You know exactly where information is stored on a computer. You know where that file is saved. We don't know how that works in the human brain. Okay, never seen a memory trace. And we know enough to say that memories aren't stored in a specific location, because there was one psychologist who went and lesioned the brains of some poor rats. He had taught them how to run a maze, so they knew their way around the maze. And then he tried lesioning their brains in different areas to see if that affected maze performance. And yeah, it would impair them, but not obliterate their memory of the maze. So no matter where he lesioned the brain, they still remembered something about the maze. And that tells us that the way the memory of the maze is stored is in multiple locations, or possibly in a deeper structure that he didn't think to cut through. Connectionism is the idea that there are units in your mind, maybe they're neurons, they have connections with each other. And memories are products of interconnected neural networks. Somehow, these neurons join together, are connected to each other in patterns. And your memory is something about pattern. I'll give you an example that supports the idea of networks. I'm going to ask you a question. I want you to answer this kind of as fast as you can. Okay? Series of questions. They're very easy questions. What color are polar bears? That is not a hard question. Okay. And what color are clouds? What color is snow? What do cows drink?
Water.
So what happened there? What just happened? Why did you all say milk? Because milk is white. Yeah. No, it's not the answer. Cows don't drink milk.
Cows do. Why would they butter if they didn't drink it?
Oh, well, calves do.
Oh, well.
Yeah, but adult cows drink water. But I see where you're coming from. It's because of something to do with whiteness. Yeah, so there's a connection between the idea of milk and cow, and then there's a connection between milk and white. And I asked you a bunch of questions: what color are polar bears, what color is snow, that primed milk by evoking whiteness, by evoking cows. You went through about 5 of those primes before I asked you the question about drinking something, which is another prime. And so that's why you ended up on milk. So that shows you that concepts are memories. You have to remember an idea. It's part of your semantic memory. This shows you that they're connected. Okay, and one idea activates another idea. There are 3 main memory processes: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Encoding is the process of getting information into the memory system. Storage is about retaining it, maintaining it over time. And retrieval is about getting the information out of memory storage, getting it out when you need it. Is that bugging you guys? Starting to bug me. Let me see if I can get them to turn it off. I have noise coming through the walls again. I'm not sure if that's.
Yeah, it's from 170.
Oh, so there's nothing I can do about it. Yeah, are they like playing something? Or... Oh, yeah. If I could turn it down, it's coming right through the walls. Thank you. We're watching a video in the next class, and so I'll ask them to turn it down. I hope that doesn't get picked up on the recording. Anyway, so retrieval is about getting information out of memory storage when you need it. And there's different ways that psychologists can measure memory. Different ways that we can study retrieval. One way is recognition. A multiple choice test is trying to test what you know, but it's using recognition because the correct answer to the question is somewhere in that list. Do you guys know the answer? Sorry?
Is it B?
Is it B? I haven't read the question. After Susie left work, she says bye to her husband and slams the door. And the loud sound makes her husband flinch. After many mornings of hearing goodbye, followed by the slam, her husband flinches when he hears her say goodbye.
I meant to say something.
Okay, in this scenario, hearing the word goodbye is it's the condition something, but is it a response?
Oh,
It's hearing a word, a response.
good. Fabulous.
Yeah, the condition stimulus that we're going to provide a conditioned response to. So now goodbye leads to the flinch. Good stuff.
Oh, it's-
What? Did I make a mistake? I do that.
no, I think I had in my head was A, but it's B.
Yes. So A is the unconditioned stimulus. And that's like, think of it as natural, but the one that naturally evokes a response. And that would be the sound of the door slamming that naturally evokes a flinch response. That's not a conditioned thing. Think of conditioning as meaning taught or trained.
Okay.
It's untaught, it's untrained, it's natural. Recall is a little harder than recognition. Recognition is easier because you just have to identify the correct answer from the list. Okay. But recall means retrieving information that's not currently in your conscious awareness. These options on the multiple choice test are all in your conscious awareness because you can see them. But with a fill in the blank question, you have to pull the answer out of your memory. Okay. So it's a little bit harder. Relearning is another measure of memory. Perhaps when you were younger, you learned to do something like play the piano or go figure skating. You haven't done that in a really long time. When you sit back at the piano and you get back on the ice, you're going to be pretty rusty, right? But if you wanted to get back to the level of performance that you were at before, you actually could do that. And you'd be faster at it than somebody who had never learned to play the piano before, who had never learned to figure skate before. So that's called relearning. It's a measure of memory. The more you practice something, the less time you need to relearn it. Hermann Ebbinghaus was a German psychologist who pioneered the experimental study of memory. He would try to memorize like a lot of nonsense syllables and then test himself on it to see what he could remember. And he found that the more times he practiced the list on day one, the less time he required to learn it on day two. The Atkinson-Schriffen model of memory is a famous model of memory in psychology that comes to us from Richard Atkinson and Richard Schriffen. It's published in 1968. And it holds that there are 3 processing stages for memory. Remember, the 3 processes are encoding, storage, and retrieval. And now these are stages. And the first stage is sensory memory. At every moment, your sensory receptors are being bombarded with all kinds of information. Okay, there's information about your body position, you're hearing things, you're seeing things, you're smelling things. You're actually not going to be consciously aware of most of that. Okay, short-term memory is where you process information, where you manipulate information before you encode, and only some of it, into long-term memory. And long-term memory can last for a really long time. Anywhere from like a minute to your entire life. But short-term memory doesn't last that long at all. Maybe 20 seconds tops. 30 seconds would really be pushing it. It could be a lot shorter than that too. Pretty much as soon as you shift your attention away from something, it's gone. Sensory memory lasts even shorter than that. Okay, maybe a second or 2. Each sense has its own form of sensory memory. And that refers to a very brief recording of the sensory information in your memory system. Right? Just for a moment or 2. Memory for visual stimuli is called iconic memory. It lasts about 1 second. How do we know that? Well, people would be displayed a stimulus like this with like letters on it. And then the researcher would play a tone. Maybe there's a low, middle, or high tone. And that corresponds to which line you're supposed to repeat back. Let's say I only show you this image for like 1 second, then take it away and play the tone. And you have to access your memory just having seen that and repeat back the 3 letters and so on. There's a 1 second window, which people are able to do that. Memory for touch is called haptic memory, lasts about 2 seconds. If I take this pen and touch my hand, take it away, and still feel it there. About 2 seconds. It's still there, and then it fades away. Okay, that's your haptic memory. Memory for your body position. So where was your limb last at? Lasts about 2 to 4 seconds. Memory for auditory stimuli, short-term sensory memory for auditory stimuli is quite a lot longer than that, even impressively long, maybe 5 to 10 seconds. Now, here's something you might have experienced. Say your friend is talking and you're pretending to listen, but maybe you're really not. Okay, maybe you're doing something else in class and your prof notices and said, you know, what was it? Are you listening? And you're like, yeah, I was listening. And they say, well, what was I just saying? And you can produce it for about like 5 to 10 seconds of it, but that's a lot, right? You know, think of somebody talking for 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. You'll be able to say, yeah, you were just talking about a code memory and how long it lasts. Even if you weren't listening, you'd be able to do that because you could pull it out of your echoic memory skillet. Theoretically, all senses have their own form of sensory memory, but I'm not aware of any research on gustatory or olfactory sensory memory. Theoretically, it'd be out there. Short-term memory lasts longer, maybe up to 20-ish seconds. And it acts like a bottleneck on all that information that's coming into your sensory memory. Most of the information that comes into your sensory memory is lost. What you're consciously aware of will make it into your short-term memory. This model is missing something. Talking about a model from like 1968. One of the things that it's missing is the role of non-conscious processing. You can be classically conditioned without even knowing it. So, and then you have a long-term memory that's based on that classical conditioning. You didn't have to be aware of that. Okay, so that's one thing that this model is missing. Anyway, back to considering this model. Short-term memory acts as a bottleneck on the information that's coming in. And there's what you can focus on and entertain your mind with. And you're going to forget most of that. Now, what were you doing on March the 7th, 2015? Probably have no clue. Alex might.
It was Monday, I know exactly what I was doing.
But is that because you know semantically what your schedule was on Mondays, or because you actually remember that day and what you did?
It's scheduled.
Okay, something more general. Then you're inferring what might have happened on that day. Oh, I must have done this. I must have done that. And then if you play that game, you can even construct a false memory. Yeah, I must have done this, and then I did the other thing, and maybe you're pulling information from out of different events in your life, and cobbling something new together. It's actually quite easy to form false memories. But ultimately, only some of that information is stored into long-term memory. Your long-term memory lasts from like 1 second to the rest of your life. So an important thing that's missing here is automatic processing, because we can learn unconsciously. Another idea that is closely associated with short-term memory, has a different theoretical background, is working memory. And working memory stresses the idea of active processing associated with short-term memory, the manipulation of information, doing calculations and computations, juggling things in your mind. And that is associated with intelligence, and particularly with fluid intelligence. Okay, but it's also limited in capacity and holds that information temporarily. How much can you hold in your short-term memory? About 7 units of information, about 7 pieces of information, plus or minus 2. It's the magical number 7. I have a question for you. What do you think it would be like? What would happen if short-term memories never went into long-term memory? Can that happen to a person?
Is it true about goldfish
like the thing about goldfish that they only have short-term memory. Or like their memory lasts about 15 seconds.
Is it true that goldfish have like a memory of how many seconds? Like only short-term memory? That sounds like what it would mean for a human to have only short-term memory. So what would the goldfish experience be?
Hey, be up for 30 seconds.
So it doesn't mind being in the tank because it can't remember where it was just at.
I don't know how to phrase this, but would that mean that a person is only not aware, but like what's happening right now? So everything that's short term is what they experience.
Yeah.
So in the future, they don't know what happened, but they're experiencing
Exactly.
what's happening right now.
Yeah, that is exactly what would happen. And maybe that's what the goldfish life is like. I'm gonna throw this to you. You have it? Okay.
So I suppose it would have a similar effect to Alzheimer's and dementia.
People on Zoom heard that very clearly, but I did not. Can you say that louder?
I suppose it would have a similar effect on the person as dementia and Alzheimer's.
I'm connecting that to something that you just said, I think you referenced this. You'd have a form of amnesia called anterograde amnesia, where you can't remember anything that happened to you after, say, the accident that caused that type of that phenomenon. So you can't form new memories. There are different kinds of dementia, and dementia is typically associated with retrograde amnesia, which is forgetting things that happened to you in the past. So somebody with Alzheimer's dementia might forget everything that happened to them. They might forget their family members.
I remember when my grandfather had dementia, for example, he'd ask for a cup of tea. After he was given it and drank the tea, he would complain that we didn't give him his tea.
But you did.
Yes, ma'am.
That must be hard on family members. Do many of you guys have like relatives with dementia? It's fairly common in later life. And it can be quite hard on caregivers. And there are a few famous patients with damage to their memory. One of them that you'll read about in your textbook is H.M. Henry Molaison, and he had severe seizures, and the doctors thought it'd be a good idea to take out his hippocampi, maybe part of his temporal lobe. And now we know why not to do that. And H.M. was not able to form any new memories. He lost some of his memory from right before the surgery, but after the surgery, a doctor would come in and introduce themselves and walk out the door, and Henry would just forget. Come back in, introduce himself again. He remembered his uncle, and he'd ask after his uncle. And when they told him that his uncle had died, he would go through grief again every single time. It's like hearing it the first time. And be shocked to look in the mirror and see that his face had changed. Another famous patient is Clive Waring. And Clive Waring had a form of like herpes that went to the brain, and the virus destroyed his hippocampi. Okay. And that resulted in complete anterograde amnesia. And here's an example of what that was like.
One man is confined to live entirely within the present with terrible consequences. Clive Waring has the worst case of amnesia ever known. 20 years ago, he lost his memory, and now his wife, Deborah, is the only person he recognizes.
Time really only has less than 30 seconds memory. And sometimes it's as little as perhaps 7 seconds. It's as little as a sentence. I'm going to see
Oops, sorry.
your sister, Adele, her daughter's got married recently
I see.
in New Zealand,
Oh,
and so they're having a party.
it's funny how the ladies acquire different title when they get married.
Do you know who I'm going to see tomorrow?
Buckingham Palace.
No, really guess.
I don't know.
You don't know.
Mm.
Adele,
Oh, I see.
do you know where I'm going?
No,
She's having a party at her house tomorrow.
it's her birthday.
No,
Mm.
do you know why?
No,
It's to do with her daughter.
I see.
Do you know why her daughter's having a party?
No,
Guess.
I don't.
She just got married.
Oh, I see.
She just got married. And do you know what country she just got married in?
No,
In New Zealand.
oh, I see.
The sentence he is in, he will probably have forgotten the sentence before. You ask him a question, and he'll give you an answer. But while he's giving you the answer, he's already forgotten the question. That's how short it is. I'm going to see your kids tomorrow.
Let's see my kids.
They're your children.
What are they up to now?
Do you know what they're up to?
No.
Guess what you think they're up to?
No, I don't guess. I know what their levels were. That was their level last time I come. So I don't know what possibility they do. No, I couldn't possibly guess.
What? Where do you think they are?
I don't know. They were there.
All you have is void. I've heard of him.
But you know that. I've never seen a human being before, never had a dream or a thought. The brain has been totally inactive, day and night the same. No thoughts at all. As far as I'm concerned, the doctors have been totally incompetent. I've never seen a doctor the whole time.
That'd be an interesting way to live. Apparently, he used to be quite upset, but has been learning to cope. But he has the belief that he's been in a coma and has just woken up. Like just woke up moments ago. And he keeps a diary, and there's like 20 years of entries like this. And so he'll write down the time and say, I'm awake for the first time. Okay, and then the next entry, right? This is the first thought I've had. You know, and then a few hours later, what is he saying? I am really superlatively, completely awake. First time. And he crosses out the stuff that he just wrote because it doesn't make sense to him. So like every 5 to 30 seconds, he thinks he's coming into consciousness for the first time after a long period of unconsciousness. And he's been doing that for something like 20 years. The documentary said that he had no memory. And this title on YouTube said that he has no short-term memory. Is that accurate? So we've heard that he has no memory. Remember the narrator saying that. And then YouTube is saying that he has no short-term memory. That true? Alex, you're shaking your head no. Why is that?
He has a couple memories. He can play the piano, which isn't something
Very
you
good.
just do. If I walked up to a piano, I can't play the piano.
He can play the piano, so he remembers that.
He remembers that, and he obviously recognizes his wife,
Yeah. So he has,
and he knows how to write.
yes.
We
Yeah.
can see that quite better than I can. again.
So he knows how to play the piano. He knows how to write. That refers to procedural memory. And that's like your knowledge of how to drive a car or ride a bike. You might not be able to explain that to anyone. You can just do it. So he still has his procedural memory. That's a kind of non-conscious implicit memory. And you pointed out that he has some very little long-term memory. He knows his wife, he even has her name there.
He knows he has kids
He
too,
knows
he
his
mentioned.
kids. He knows he has a sister.
Yeah.
What else does he know? Yeah, yeah,
He still has language.
he still has language. So he knows words, that's vocabulary. So
He knows
and
how to do a lot. It
Yeah,
doesn't
like
appear like he lost any capabilities beyond memory. It's just his memories, not
Yeah.
his
his
capabilities.
wife takes him out to dinner, and so he would know how to sort of behave in a restaurant, but he wouldn't know, he'd forget what food he was eating by the time the fork reached his mouth.
He knows how to ring a doorbell and sit at the door.
Yeah, yeah, I wonder if that's procedural, or semantic, so vocabulary, memory for words. He also asks about something about Buckingham Palace, so he knows what Buckingham Palace is. That's another form of long-term memory. So it looks like he has lost a lot of his long-term memory. Right? He knows he has kids, that they were taking their O levels. That's kind of a British thing about high school exams. So he's lost a lot of it. He has severe retrograde amnesia. He has a very little bit of it. And then he has a bad case of anterograde amnesia. He can't form new, explicit, declarative memories. However, people like Clive Waring and HM can form new implicit memories, new non-conscious memories. They can still be classically conditioned. And here's an example of that. It's quite difficult to trace something in a mirror. And the psychologist gave him a mirror tracing task and timed how long it took him to do it. And then they gave him a few more trials, and he got faster and faster at that task. That showed that he remembered something, that he learned something even, but it's implicit. Your memory for spatial location is also implicit. People like Clive and HM wouldn't be able to tell you where the bathroom is on the ward. If you ask them where's the bathroom, they wouldn't know. But if they needed to go, they would just get up and go. They'd find their way there. So according to this model here, you have two kinds of memory, basically conscious and unconscious, explicit and implicit, declarative and non-declarative, effortful or automatic. On the conscious side, you have the memories that you can consciously recall. Some engagement of your hippocampus and frontal lobes there. That includes your semantic memory, memory for facts, like Buckingham Palace, what that is in words, general knowledge, and your episodic memory, which is memories from your personal life, what you did yesterday. On the automatic or non-conscious side, you have memories that are processed in a different part of your brain, cerebellum and basal ganglia. And that includes your memory for space, for time. You have a general sense of how long you've been in this room. Okay, for frequency. You have procedural memory, like the memory, like Clive's memory for playing the piano. That's procedural memory. Still has that, probably still learn procedurally. A great thing that maybe his wife could do is say, learn to ballroom dance. You would remember doing it, but you get better and better at it. And your memories for classical conditioning are also implicit. Sea slugs can be classically conditioned. Unconscious people can be classically conditioned. Might wonder how they do that. They do that by puffing air at the eye, make somebody blink. And let's say you have some kind of a stimulus that precedes the puff of air, like maybe a tone. You get the person to blink to the tone. There was another example of a patient like this who a doctor used to always shake hands with as part of the little ritual. And one day he put a thumbtack in his hand. The next day, patient didn't want to shake hands with him. Okay, she pulled her hand back. That showed a classically conditioned response very quickly. You can, when you first learn something, like driving, that requires conscious awareness. If you keep practicing it, you can come to the point where it's automatic. And it's now stored in your procedural memory compartment, wherever that is. And maybe when you learned to drive, you were like this, and you were very, very aware of everything you were doing. But maybe now you could go somewhere and forget how you got there, not realize what you were doing. Like, how did I get here? Because you drove there kind of automatically. So enough practice can put something that was once engaging your explicit conscious processing and put that on your automatic track. So explicit memories rely on the frontal lobes and hippocampus. Frontal lobes have a role in the distinctiveness of memories and how they're organized. People who have frontal lobe damage might not be able to recall things in the correct order. So disorganized memories. The hippocampus is part of the limbic system, and it temporarily holds on to elements of an explicit memory before moving it to some other brain region for long-term storage. That's called memory consolidation. Sleep is really important to that process. Remember that next time you stay up all night to cram for an exam. You might do more damage to your memory by staying up at night than the cost of that may be more than what you gained by studying. The hippocampi, you have two of them, one on either side, are not fully developed at birth. And so you do not have any memories of being a baby. If you have any memories of being a baby, those are false memories. Your earliest memory is probably around like age 3. And that's because the hippocampi need time to develop. Your implicit memory system involves the cerebellum and basal ganglia. And the cerebellum plays an important role in storing memories that are created by classical conditioning. And memories of physical skills are also held there. The basal ganglia are involved in memory for skills. The basal ganglia are involved in voluntary movement. People with Parkinson's disease struggle to make voluntary movements. And they have damage to the dopaminergic neurons in the basal ganglia. The amygdala, you actually have two of them, the amygdalae. We talk about it as if there was only one of them. Anyway, the amygdala is associated with emotion and emotional processing, especially like fear and anger. If you get stressed, then there's a flood of stress hormones, particularly adrenaline. And that provokes the amygdala to store an emotional memory. people who have damage to the amygdala, but not the hippocampus, can remember what happened to them without any emotional component. People who have damage to the hippocampus or hippocampi, but not the amygdala, can forget what happened, but still retain the emotional component of the memory. Like Clive still knows that he loves his wife. There's a role for adrenaline in the storage of emotional, particularly traumatic memories, and memories that form when you're really super stressed. And so taking a drug called propranolol, it's a beta blocker, it suppresses adrenaline after a traumatic event, can decrease the chance of people developing a traumatic memory. So if something bad happens to you, try to relax. That's hard. When something bad happens to you, you get all wound up. Yes.
Like one time I was watching a show and this lady, it was like a TV show, so it wasn't real, but this lady got attacked. And then when she went to the hospital, they told her that she should like stay awake all night in the hospital and not go to sleep so that she have
Oh,
less of a chance of
remembering it, that makes
Is
sense.
that like another way of?
Yeah, it would interfere with your ability to form memory, but not the emotional component's more of an amygdala thing than a hippocampus thing. But sleep deprivation kind of impairs the functioning of everything in the brain. So it sounds reasonable to me. What happened to the microphone? Oh, it's back there. Okay.
Got it?
Ah, yeah. Thank you. And emotional memories you can experience them like they're called flashbulb memories. You have a very vivid image of something that happened. But the fact that it's vivid and you're confident that it happened doesn't prove that it's accurate though. The neural mechanism or basis for memory is called long-term potentiation. And basically, neurons that fire together wire together. So Kendall and Schwartz demonstrated long-term potentiation with sea slugs, and they showed it with classical conditioning. They wanted to know what was going on at the neural level, okay, as this response is learned and retained. Well, there are changes at the level of the neuron. And you can see that the potentiated neuron, right? This is the connection between two neurons. And that connection's been potentiated because they have fired together. They're fired together, now they're gonna wire together. And what that means, there's more neurotransmitter in the synaptic vesicles. And more neurotransmitters being released into the synapse, and there's more receptors on the receiving neuron. So long-term potentiation refers to the strengthening of the connections between neurons from repetitive stimulation in such a way that makes them fire together. That has an important role in learning and memory. So what do we know about memory that could help you remember things, which I'm sure you have to do in your undergraduate career? Well, rehearsal matters. The more you rehearse something, the more likely you are to remember it, to get it consolidated into long-term memory. And we tend to be overconfident in what we know, and therefore overlearning works. So if you think you know something after repeating it to yourself 10 times, make that 50 times. We know that that distributed practice works better than mass practice. If you are going to spend 2 hours studying, you're better off breaking that up into 4 half-hour sessions than 1 2-hour-long session. If you're going to study in a class, you're best off doing your readings every day or a couple of times a week, versus leaving it all to the last minute, you know, staying up all night and cramming the textbook, which is kind of what I used to do. I was a bad student as an undergrad, but I don't want you to end up like me. So with procrastinating and avoiding study, what might be going on there is put yourself on a negative reinforcement schedule. You're afraid of the test. You're afraid of studying, so you don't do it. And then you start getting really stressed about the upcoming test. And now you're more afraid of the test and failing the test. And that's why you start studying. Not the best reinforcement schedule to be on. You can put yourself on a positive reinforcement schedule, start studying earlier. You're not too stressed. Maybe you enjoy it a bit. You might like it. Maybe you'll do it again. And then the test won't be so hard. There's also an effect of testing that's like a practice effect. If you test yourself on the material, you're more likely to remember it when you're actually being tested. Because taking tests is like a skill that you learn. You can practice. So you can increase your chance of retrieving information by practicing retrieving it, by testing yourself. As you know, sleep is very important. You will mess with your hippocampi if you don't. Okay, you need to sleep in order to consolidate long-term memories and in order to be able to pull out information from your long-term memory. There are fun strategies for remembering things. They're called mnemonic devices. I think Mnemone is the Greek goddess of memory. There are acronyms that help you remember a longer word. I think like ADHD stands for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And you can use an acronym you can create an acronym in an acrostic where the acronym represents a sentence. And people use these when they have to remember things in an ordered way. Medical school students, pharmacy students, nursing students do this a lot. I remember once when I was doing tutorials in pharmacy, feeling completely shocked by something a student said. The students are very professional and polished. And then this young lady said something that just startled me. And I thought I don't know how to respond. And am I supposed to report this? And then another student responded with, as if she were prompted, this list of, I don't know, maybe there were nerves in the hands. This one that I found up there is like the most appropriate to put on a slide without getting myself in trouble, but they're like really, really dirty. Like things about virgins. And they work better if they come with vivid imagery, even if they're a bit emotionally shocking. The method of loci is quite a powerful way to remember things. In this one, you take advantage of your spatial memory. You're going to hook the new information into your spatial memory. So there's a path that you know very well in your life, like maybe the path from your dorm room to the cafeteria. You take the things that you want to remember, they're like a list, and you physically place them along the way. So let's say I wanted to remember soap, lettuce, and honey. Well, as you open the door from your dorm room, there's soap left on the floor. The janitor's been cleaning it. And then you walk over soap and you push the elevator button, but yuck, it's got honey on it. So you go and find the stairs and you notice that somebody has dropped their groceries on the stairs and some lettuce. And when you want to retrieve that list, you mentally go back and walk through that journey. Another one's called the peg word technique. If you ever heard 1 is a bun, 2 is a shoe, 3 is a tree, that's the idea. So you memorize this list, and then you hook the new information onto what you already know, which is this list. And so you'll have to associate, say, honey with soap with a bun. So maybe I'll imagine that the icing on the bun is actually soap. And the next thing was honey. So now I imagine a shoe with honey in it. Yeah. And than lettuce. So maybe I'll imagine a tree with lettuce leaves. Okay, that's the idea. Neat little hierarchies like this one are also a great way to remember information because they organize it. Okay. You want to remember things better, try to process that information more deeply. Shallow processing encodes things on a pretty basic level. An example of this is repeating a phone number to yourself until you go and dial the number. But you'll remember it better if you try to make something meaningful. Okay, try to encode that information based on meaning. And that's what we're doing with that peg word technique. Okay, creating meaningful associations that you'll remember later. Great way to do it is to hook the new information in to your episodic memory. Most people have excellent memories for the things that happen to them. So whatever you're trying to learn, try to relate that to yourself in some way. What does that have to do with some story about something that happened to you? Back to the processing. I saw that picture there. Now I remember why I put it there. When you're reading your book, your textbook, the shallowest level of processing would just be to read it line to line. But you could process that more deeply by highlighting, by jotting notes in the margins. I hope your textbook looks something like that. I know some people want to resell their textbooks so they keep it nice and clean, but if you can afford to keep your textbook, just go to town on it, like write in the margins, pull out main themes, because that's processing, that's active processing, and you're more likely to remember things later if you do that. Try to encode the information more than one way. Okay, so if you're reading and you're relying on your visual memory, well, why not also read it out loud to yourself? Because now you're going to remember your voice reading it. Okay, underline and highlight and go to town. Summarize and paraphrase, and that's what your notes should be doing. Summarizing and paraphrasing. Draw charts and figures. Gauge your physical memory. So if there's a chart in your textbook or a graph, trace it with your finger. That'll help you remember it too. Use mnemonic devices. Try to relate the information to yourself. Those are all strategies you can use to try to remember things. After you learn something, you will forget it pretty rapidly. If you try to, let's say you learn all the material in the course, you will forget most of it soon after the end of the course. Actually, let me bring that to the lecture level, to a class level. You're going to forget much of what you learned immediately after class, and then you will hold on to a percentage of it, assuming you're listening, maybe something like 40% for a long time. So one thing you can do to help head this off is review your notes at the end of a lecture. So let's say you were keeping notes. At the end of class, stay behind for 1 minute and read over them. And that will help gel what you learned. Otherwise, you'll forget it quite quickly. And then you're left reviewing them before the test a few days after you took them. In other classes, maybe a few months after you took them. You've forgotten so much, so it's like you're learning it all over again. Take the opportunity to gel it in there. Because unrehearsed information is actually forgotten quite quickly. Context-dependent memory means that you are likely to recall something better if you learned it in the same context, if you encoded it in the same context. So you will do better on your quizzes if you take them in the same place that you studied for your quiz as you read your textbook and reviewed your lecture material. Okay. If you can, get into the classroom, but you know that if you're going to be tested in a certain classroom, go to that classroom to study. You're more likely to remember things because you learn them in that same room on that test that's held in that room. State-dependent memory applies to like your physical or psychological state. If you are in a bad mood, you're more likely to remember bad things that put you in a bad mood. If you are feeling happy, you're more likely to remember things in your life that make you feel happy. If some people get drunk and say lose their keys or hide some alcohol, and in order to find it, they have to get drunk again. At least that's the story. Forgetting isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think it might be a good thing to forget your friend's old number, might want to. Or might be a good thing to forget a bad experience that you don't need to think about anymore. Most of the information that comes in to us is not retained in long-term memory. The one reason for being unable to recall something is that you never encoded it in the first place. It was never encoded into long-term memory in the first place. According to that Atkinson-Triffin model, which is a model and a theory, there's no storage limit to long-term memory. And they would say that you can put all kinds of things into your long-term memory. Problem is that you're not able to pull them out again. Other people might say, well, no, you could damage a part of somebody's brain and then they'll lose their memories. Maybe there's the physical trace somehow declines or deteriorates. According to this Atkinson-Triffin model, there's an unlimited store for your long-term memory. But it's like putting things up in the attic. You might not be able to find them again. And that's why it's good to try to encode things in as many ways as you can, because that's like having more pathways to the thing in the attic. So maybe we forget because we never encoded it. Maybe we forget because there's some kind of physical decline in the memory trace. We know that brain damage is associated with forgetting. Yes.
I'm just curious because I'm kind of confused. How can you have a memory but not remember it? Like not be able to retrieve it within.
Yeah, how can the psychologist say that's what's going on? I see your question. There's an example, tip of the tongue phenomenon. Maybe you're writing a test and you know the answer to that fill in the blank question, but you just can't pull it out. But you know it's in there. That feeling is called tip of the tongue phenomenon. And people who have that feeling are right about it because they can be given a recall cue and then they get it. So that's what we would do to measure that. But this is a big theory and we can't empirically test our big theories to the extent we want to. So a lot of things are just at the level of assumption and speculation. So maybe it's a retrieval failure, and good question, how do you know? Maybe it's interference from other memories, right? So let's say you move to a new place, but you keep writing your old address down on paperwork. That is called proactive interference because the new memory is being impaired. And then there's retroactive interference, and that's when the new information interferes with, impairs the old information when you're trying to retrieve. So maybe you learn to play a new song, and now you can't play the old song anymore because your memory for the new song starts coming in there. And this happens with people who start learning a new language that's similar to another one they speak. If you speak French and then you start learning Spanish, and that messes up your French. That's retroactive interference. We often think of our memories as if they were like a video recording of an event. That's not quite right. Memory is highly constructed. It's not like we save the file, and then we can pull it up later exactly the way it was before. It's more like you pull up the file, and actually the file is corrupted a little since the last time you opened it. And now we're going to edit it and save it again. And when you pull it up the next time, it's changed from the first time it was saved. That's the idea of reconsolidation. If you imagine something, that fantasy can become a memory because you remember the fantasy, but now you think that it was real. So you confuse something you imagined with something that actually happened because they're both saved in your memory. We can get confused about how or where or when we learn something or when something happened. You could mix up memories of your 10th birthday party with memories of your 11th or 9th birthday party or other birthdays. And to create a new memory of your 10th birthday that has bits of other birthdays in it, maybe other people's birthdays. And then we're social creatures and people are suggestible. So asking leading questions can get people to create false memories. If a police officer says, well, you know, what color jacket was the suspect wearing? Well, let's say they weren't wearing a jacket, they're wearing a black t-shirt, but you think, oh, must be wearing a jacket. You're assuming that there was a jacket. And now you say, oh, it was a black jacket. And you just created a memory of something that you never saw in the first place. Yes, I'm gonna throw this at you. Better this one. Good. All right.
Thank you. So I've heard much talk about speaking things into being. So based on what you're saying, suppose I am one who lacks charisma, but I keep telling myself that I'm the most charismatic person to exist and that I've performed several activities that a very charismatic person would do. After a while, would I eventually subconsciously believe?
Yeah, people do things like that. You try it, see how it goes. Yeah, you can imagine something and then have that become a part of your self-concept. I don't know if self-deception is the best one, so. People can ask questions that contain an assumption. You accept the assumption. Now you recreate your memory based on that. There's an example from Elizabeth Loftus's research. She showed people video footage of a car accident and then asked some of the people, how fast were the cars going when they contacted each other, when they hit each other, when they bumped each other, when they collided, when they smashed? You can see that people's estimates of how fast the car was going increased with this more dramatic language. Because when they ask you, well, how fast were they going when they smashed together? Now you're imagining smashing, you're mixing that up with your memory of the actual event. Okay. I recently had a false memory. It was an example of source misattribution and an imagination effect. And it was so realistic that I was honestly stunned that it was a false memory, and it was a good learning experience for me. I wouldn't have understood it had I not taught this class and known about false memories. But people who report discrimination and harassment in an organization risk retaliation. That's a reason why a lot of people don't report. And this is security camera footage that I FOI popped, right? You can ask for any footage of you, emails of you at the university, because the university is a public body. And as a PhD student, I made a very big mistake of seeking help with an equity issue. I just needed help navigating the situation, didn't want to get anyone in trouble, but they retaliated, right? And as hard as they could. And it kind of blew my mind that the university's sort of anti-discrimination and harassment officer with HR assisted in that and participated. And she helped them get out of trouble and get me into hot water, right? As much as they could cook up. Like that was the person that was supposed to help me. So that certainly made me more interested in organizational psychology. And anyway, the retaliation was basically false incidents that I was supposed to be disciplined over, that they'd agree that I had done, and the fake or vexatious complaints. I wasn't allowed to see, who they were or know who was making them. I wasn't allowed to talk about it. Anyway, so that video shows that person chasing me, yelling at me, she's looking for me in the atrium, comes after me, chases me down the hall. There's no audio, but she's making all kinds of threats. She's going to, get me into trouble and, has all kinds of people watching me and some kind of nonsense. But that was stressful. And when she's running after me, my mind is racing and I'm thinking, I have to go to security, right? I can't have an unwitnessed conversation about her with this person, right? And I'm thinking that's one floor down from him. And she's going to chase me down a flight of stairs. Okay. And I'm wearing heels. Or I'm going to have to get in an elevator with her alone. And she's yelling at me and threatening me. And so when I sort of talked about this to my mentors, I remembered being in the elevator with her. I remembered pushing the elevator button. Like I told them that we went down the elevator together. They're like, no, you never get in an elevator with somebody. There's no security camera footage. Okay. But the professor I talked to thought it didn't make sense because security and the hallway in that atrium are actually on the same floor. Like I swore that it happened. We looked at campus maps. It was so real to me, but it didn't happen, right? The elevator ride was a false memory, right? I had imagined I'm going to have to do this with her. And I've been in that elevator many times before. And so I created this false memory. And I am, in retrospect, I'm so glad that I first talked to people I could trust about it. Because imagine if I'd gone to some HR person, right, in an organization that retaliates, right? And then even if I was acting in good faith, with that false memory, like had I reported that to the university, like that would just have undermined me. I might have ended up in more trouble. Okay, got her off the hook, and it would have sort of, helped the lawyer pick holes in the story and make me look like a liar. I am so glad that I had people who were safe to talk to, who were like, hey, wait a minute, I don't think that those places are on the same floor. And that I was able to clean that up before we then went and dealt with it. It's good to have mentors you can trust. Anyway, we tend to believe witnesses overall. If somebody says they saw something happened, we tend to believe that. Juries really tend to believe that. And unfortunately, you can really be confident that you saw something, even be telling the truth. Like, not people lie, but maybe you're not lying, and you can have a false memory. And so there are many cases where people have been, have been sentenced, have gone to jail for things they didn't do because there was faulty eyewitness testimony. Okay. There's questions about repressed memories. Like if you have a really traumatic experience, Freud might say, oh, you repress that. Or do you vividly remember it? Well, brains are complicated and you can actually do both. So some people, like people with PTSD, vividly remember the traumatic experience. But there's also something called dissociative amnesia. Some people deal with stress by dissociating and forgetting. So I'd say the answer is both. And there's controversy around this for social and political reasons. If somebody says they've been victimized, should you believe them? The whole Amber Heard, Johnny Depp thing. There was a moral panic in the 1980s, a satanic panic, where psychologists had been unintentionally causing false memories in people, that they'd been abused as children, like satanically abused. And there was some pretty big cases over this, and people went to jail. But those weren't real memories. So you can see that the implications are serious. Children are even more likely to get drawn into suggestive interviewing. There is one study that found that about 58% of preschoolers produced false stories about an experience they didn't have when they were led to. Okay, so when children are being interviewed, it's really important that the person who's questioning them, really knows what they're doing and is neutral, impartial, and doesn't ask leading questions using words they don't understand. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, there's a field called forensic psychology. We actually have a graduate program in. And so they might question, is evidence reliable? Might wonder, is a person criminally responsible if they have some kind of a mental illness? Might do the interviews with children. And they might also be clinical psychologists who work with the prison population. Forensic psychologists who assess whether evidence is reliable are taking a different perspective than a counseling psychologist. If you are counseling somebody with who's describing a traumatic experience, then it's not really your place to question that. You're not an investigator, you're not a detective, you're not a lawyer for the defense or the prosecution, okay? And so you understand that as narrative. And narratives are stories, and they include information that's true, that's kind of partly true. Certain things are dismissed or disregarded, other things are emphasized and highlighted, and sometimes they include false memories. And what this counseling psychologist says is, well, that doesn't minimize their personal significance, but they function to symbolically indicate what the person needs to know about themselves so that they can, navigate a transition. So in that form of psychotherapy, your focus isn't on judging the narrative as true or false, right? You're judging the narrative as having adaptive or maladaptive value. Like, does it help this person live a meaningful life, right? How is that story working for them? Right? Is it guiding them adaptively? If it isn't, you might try to shift the story a bit. Okay, so those are two very different perspectives in psychology about, let's say, traumatic incidents or stories. Thank you for your attention. And I'll see you next week for our last reading class.
Okay.